Hello and welcome to our lesson on the War of the Roses. This is our fifth case study in the question of power during the medieval times, and it is one of the more complex ones. So hopefully this video will help you understand it and in all its complexities. At the very simple core of it is a story of barons fighting over power, and weak kings failing to control powerful barons, and stronger kings succeeding in doing so. But before we get there, we need to kind of define the characters of the story, and there are so many of them. And this is obviously a simplification, but I'd like to try and help us all out in trying to understand the story by giving you a simple story with simple characters, and we can then maybe try to make it more complex. So here, this is the sheet you should be having in front of you. This sheet here sets out the key characters for your story, the War of the Roses. So I'm going to go through each character, each side, so to speak, in this baronial war, and then we'll finish with looking at the actual story. So first things first, on our left of the sheet, we need to define the Lancastrians. Now, the Lancastrians were a powerful family, a powerful baronial family, with land in, obviously, Lancaster, but land all around England at the time, and their most notable successor or succeeding character is the man Henry Bolingbroke, who we recently met as the Baron who Henry Bolingbroke overthrew Richard II to become Henry IV, son of John of Gaunt, and part of the Lancastrian family. So Bolingbroke takes the throne, redefines the throne as being his legitimate throne, and him being the legitimate heir to the throne by his relations to previous monarchs. And when he dies, his son takes over by the name of Henry V, creatively named, taking the throne in 1413 to 1422. He's seen as quite a successful king, successful in wars against famously France, the Battle of Agincourt. And after Henry V dies, there is a problem, because when Henry V dies, his 9-month-old son is the next on the throne, and he is the next to take the throne. He becomes the king on his own from 1422, but at the age of 9 months, he's obviously in a period of advice. He needs a period of advice, of regency, and he receives advice most notably from our third Duke of Somerset by a man named, Duke of Somerset. And Henry VI's advisor, we're going to see what happens to him. He's a very powerful baron, and particularly how he is eventually killed by the Duke of York. And that brings us to the second family that we need to be filling out in our sheet, the Yorkists, the Lancastrians and the Yorkists, the two rival baronial families of the age. So one of our notable figures, who has just been referenced in the previous character, is Richard III, Duke of York. And the Duke of York here is also an advisor to Henry VI, and he kills, as has been laid out already, the third Duke of Somerset, a famous, powerful Lancastrian advisor. And he does so in 1460. We're going to come and see that in a second. Our second key figure is Edward IV. Edward IV, king twice during the reign this century. First between 1461 and 1470, and secondly between 1471 and 1483. He is son of the third Duke of York. He defeats and deposes Henry VI in 1461, only to be deposed and then retake the throne again a year later in 1471. The Earl of Warwick is a difficult figure. He becomes Edward IV's chief advisor. He had been a Yorkist, but he switches sides again and goes back to the Yorkists in 1469, and forces Edward IV to flee the throne, killing and then being killed by Edward's men in 1471. Edward V is the son of Edward IV. He becomes a king at 14, taking over after the death of his father, and mysteriously is one of the two kings, never crowned, but who went missing because of their tutelage and their care by the name of a man called Richard III. Richard III, uncle of Edward V, another notable Yorkist, supposedly the chief advisor to the young Edward the fifth, you should say Edward the Fifth there, who is his nephew, but he uses this opportunity to take the throne himself. And as we may know, there's a lot of speculation about what happened to Edward V, but certainly he was killed. He went missing, and most likely at the hands of Richard III. And that brings us finally to the figure who ends the War of the Roses, the figure who kills Richard III. On the right-hand side of our screen, Henry Tudor. Henry Tudor, who was a distant relative actually of Henry VI, but very distant, didn't really have a very clear claim to the throne at all, but came over from France in order to kill Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field, and established the Tudor rule. The Tudor rule, which brings to an end after the establishment of the Henry Tudor or Henry VII, brings to the end the Wars of the Roses. So those are our key characters. But we now need to know the story. How do these characters take part in the Wars of the Roses? And it's perfectly important to say that War of the Roses can actually be seen as the... But we now need to know the story. How do these characters take part in the Wars of the Roses? And it's perfectly important to say that War of the Roses can actually be seen as the Wars of the Roses. There are multiple wars. We begin in 1413. And as I've said before, 1413 is the year in which Henry Bolingbroke, the man who usurped and deposed Richard II, takes the throne and eventually, dies in 1413. His son Henry V becomes king. Henry V, seen as a very successful monarch, able to fight wars in France and succeed in taking land back, as he sees it, from the French. But he dies of dysentery whilst fighting in France. Now, after that, Henry VI is forced to take the throne. I mean, Henry VI at this time is only 9 months old, and so therefore rules alongside a council of nobles. Now, with any king who is unable to fully rule, nobles do take up roles of advice or councils. The problem here is that obviously nobles fight for positions of power and positions of influence, and particularly when you've got a 9-month-old king, England therefore is open to disagreements among the nobles. But for the most part, they put their own interests to the side for the good of what they see the good of the kingdom being. This begins to change though once Henry VI takes his own rule. In 1437 he's old enough to rule by himself, but unfortunately many historians have said that he was a weak and ineffective king. Now there's lots of speculation on why. He certainly is undeniable that he loses lands that his father Henry V won, and he also is prone to bouts of depression, or what we would call depression today, bouts of discontent, or at least disinterested in his role as king, and senior nobles tried to basically rule in his name. There were economic problems facing England at the time. In 1450, a violent protest called the Jack Cade Rebellion breaks out, which is all about the kind of discontent with conditions of particularly peasants in Western England. The situation only worsens between 1450 and 55 as Henry VI, and this is sometimes known as Henry VI's absent rule. And this is when Henry VI, although being there, is not necessarily active. And the two of the most powerful nobles in the kingdom at this time, the Duke of York and the Duke of Somerset, as we've already met, compete to be the most powerful noble and be the effective de facto ruler of the country, whilst the king is in absence. And there's a clash over this. They fight over this, and there's a battle at St. Albans. And at this point, Somerset, the Duke of Somerset, the Lancastrian, is killed by the Yorkist Duke of York. Despite Henry VI's obvious incapacity, most nobles understand that civil war would be a disaster. They'd had multiple ones before, and they realise that it weakens the kingdom, it weakens the stability of lands, and they therefore feel a duty to stay loyal to Henry VI. However, by 1459, the Lancaster family is beginning to suspect that the third Duke of York plans not only to advise, but effectively to rule and depose Henry VI himself. And again, this leads to a real build-up of tension, and each side builds up an army, and a series of battles take place. The Duke of York is killed in a battle in 1460, but his son Edward wins the decisive Battle of Towton. And Edward, the son of Duke of York, therefore a Yorkist. So the titles for these you would want to give these events really is up to you, but I think certainly we're starting to see titles that should involve things like baronial conflict, kings unable to control, battles and civil wars between barons. So, having won the Battle of Towton, Edward sees his chance to seize the throne. He deposes Henry VI, who flees from England, and makes himself Edward IV. So the Yorkists are now in charge. Edward gradually restores peace and stability during this period, establishing power with the help of the powerful Earl of Warwick. And by 1464, the remaining Lancastrians are defeated, and Henry VI is captured before escaping again to Scotland. Between 1464 and 1468, Warwick and Edward IV fall out over what to do about war with France and about Edward's marriage. He had secretly married for love, but Warwick had expected him to make a political alliance, particularly in a country at the time that was so unstable. Marriage really wasn't about love. It shouldn't have been about love, according to Warwick. It should have been about political alliance and colluding and finding compromise between warring families. Edward had also refused to grant Warwick more power in government, and Warwick becomes discontented. Warwick, having joined Edward IV, then forces him to flee the country. And Warwick effectively Warwick rebels against Edward and forces him to flee the country. However, England gain helps. Warwick is becoming discontented, and at this time, barons, when they are discontented, seem able to do more than just complain. And in 1469, Warwick rebels against Edward IV and forces him to flee the country. However, Edward, having fled, gains help from the Duke of Burgundy and returns with an army to defeat and kill Warwick in 1471. Edward orders the murder not just of Warwick, but certainly of Henry VI, who had, for a time, retaken the throne. This is an attempt to remove any potential rivals to him or his future heirs. And between this period of 1471 to 83, England becomes relatively stable again. The civil wars between barons cease, and Edward IV seems to be in charge again, able to control his barons and control his lands. But in 1483, Edward dies, and at this point, the throne carries over to his 13-year-old son, Edward V. Now, the young king's reign is only in place for 3 months. He's not even crowned. And the reason for this is because his uncle, Richard III, as you know he's about to become, seizes the throne. And he does this despite the fact that Edward IV had trusted his brother, the uncle of his child, to look after Edward V in his young age until he became old enough to rule himself. Edward and his younger brother disappear, most famously disappearing in somewhere within the Tower of London, and we assume they are murdered by some of Richard III's supporters. And Richard III rules for 2 years, but is seen by many as an illegitimate heir to the throne, and the Yorkists being on the throne face a lot of disagreement and discontent from their barons. And Richard III faced opposition from those who believed he'd seized it illegally. Rebels rally around this figure of Henry Tudor, a distant relative of Henry VI, and therefore a distant relative of Lancastrians. And in August 1485, Henry invades England and kills Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth. And this, subsequently we are to find out, ends the civil war between the barons, the Wars of the Roses, as Henry Tudor becomes Henry VII, establishes rule through various clever tricks and use of patronage, which we will learn about soon, in order to establish his position as the rightful, unchallengeable monarch of England. And that is the end of the story. If you can remember which one was which. Which of these were Yorkists? Which of these were Lancastrians? So we'll start at the top. And I hope you know by now that Henry Bolingbroke was most obviously a Lancastrian. Henry V, also a Lancastrian. Henry VI, also a Lancastrian. The 3rd Duke of Somerset, an advisor to Henry VI and also a Lancastrian. Richard III, Duke of York, also an advisor to Henry VI, but eventually, whilst removing a Lancastrian advisor, is of course a Yorkist. Edward IV, son of the Duke of York, is of course a Yorkist. Edward V, the son of Edward IV, who becomes king for only a few months, is of course also a Yorkist. Richard III, the killer of Edward V, but also surprisingly a Yorkist. And finally, the Earl of Warwick, who becomes Edward IV's chief advisor, as well as forcing him to flee from the throne when he feels he hasn't got enough power, and also being killed by the Yorkists, is both at different points a Yorkist and a Lancastrian. So hopefully that made sense. I hope now you've had a chance to consider this wider inquiry question. Who really ruled England between the period circa 1000 to 1485? Now we've looked at many figures, many rulers, many challenges to rulers during this period, including ones before 1066 and before the rule of the Normans. And I want you to definitely consider those when thinking about this, what challenges there were. But one of the things we've been doing recently is looking at our 5 case studies. And those case studies were Henry II and his relationship with Becket, King John I and his relationship with the barons, Henry III and Edward I and their relationships with Parliament and Simon de Montfort, in the case of Henry III, Richard II's deposition by a baron, Simon de Montfort, Richard II's deposition by a baron, Henry Bolingbroke, and finally, and arguably as a result of that deposition, the Wars of the Roses of the 15th century. When doing so, we should have considered the following questions, and should have actually answered these questions in our table. When these challenges happened, who were competing for the powers to rule the country or to really rule the country? What was the basic or trigger cause of the tensions in each case, and what were the underlying causes? And finally, and this one the more difficult question, what did this clash do to the balance of power within the political nation? Now we've seen examples of monarchs being challenged by other monarchs, most notably early on with the battle in 1066 for the crown, as well as the battle between King Canute and Athelred. Before that, we've seen challenges from the church, as we've given with Becket. We've seen challenges from the barons. King John I was forced to sign a document to rule with the barons. Henry III was forced to rule with the barons through the institution of Parliament, and Edward I smartly went along with that as well. Richard II was not just forced to sign anything or work with the barons, but was replaced by a baron, that being Henry Bolingbroke. And finally, the War of the Roses was really a story of the war of different baronial families, the families of the Lancastrians and the Yorkists, and their real lack of royal power. So when considering this question, we might want to say that actually during this period, the role and the power of the barons within the political nation seems to be slowly but surely increasing, to a point in which they are effectively rulers and even de facto rulers by the 15th century. And that story will change soon when we meet the Tudors. But for now, I think that's a really important trend to be sketching during this period, and when thinking about our answer to this question of who really ruled. I think the church managed to maintain its power during this period. Certainly, it managed to maintain its own church courts, its importance in the daily lives of most people. The people, or the peasants, attempt to try and establish themselves within the political nation, but are shut out by Richard II as a young king during the Peasants' Revolt. Parliament is certainly increasing in its power and is heavily linked to the barons in terms of its role, because it is effectively an institution of the barons. And we'll see also Parliament becoming more important during the Tudor period, but certainly not just the barons within Parliament becoming more important, and that's something to bear in mind. So ultimately, I think when you consider this question, what you want to be asking is, who was in the political nation at the beginning of our course, and who was in the political nation by the time we finish in 1485? And finally, how much power did each of those actors have?